Welcome to this week's On the Fly. I'm your host, Gene DeFilippo, and our guest today is the very successful Senior Vice President for Basketball at the NCAA, Dan Gavitt. Dan, it's great to see you again, my friend.
Gene, great to see you always. A long history, great friendship, and I appreciate being with you always.
Yeah. You know, as I look out at basketball, it's so great for me to see you and the way you have taken over and grown this position. When you and I were younger, it was Dave Gavitt, it was C.M. Newton, and Tom Jernstedt, and they probably were the big three of college basketball for years and years. And it's wonderful that you have followed up and that you have taken over this basketball. I'm so proud of you. And we are all so happy that you're in this position.
Well, thanks, Gene. You're talking about three Hall of Famers, so I'm not sure I'm anywhere near their company, but we try to honor them and all those that came before us, and keeping the basketball championships as special as they are, and working hard for the players and the coaches to keep the game healthy and forward thinking. So it's a pleasure and honor to be able to be in this position and try to help the game.
Great. Let's talk about the NCAA tournament. It's coming up in early February that your committee will come to Indianapolis and you'll be put through a practice run. But before we get there, tell us how you've assigned the committee. Do you assign them to conferences? Do you give them certain teams? What are they doing right now? Are they watching a lot of basketball games? Tell us about your committee.
Sure. Well, they are watching an awful lot of basketball games. The committee is a committee of 12 now for both men and women, mostly conference commissioners and athletic directors that serve on the committee a 5-year term. Their work is really all season long. They literally start the evaluation process for teams on the very first night of the basketball season and follow and watch games either on TV or on Synergy or many different ways that they can access games all across the country, either live or on demand. And each committee member, except for the chair, is assigned about 4 or 5 conferences to monitor, either as a primary monitor or a secondary monitor. So each conference, all 32, have 2 committee members assigned to monitor that conference. And what that means is that those committee members essentially become experts for their colleagues on the teams in that conference. They watch them, they talk on a regular basis with the conference commissioners and or his or her designee to get background information on all the teams in their league. And the committee members don't advocate for the teams the conferences that they monitor. That's not their role, but it is their role to be the expert in the room on that conference by really focusing in on the number of teams in the league and those that would be candidates for at-large consideration, or that will be seeded accordingly once we get to the seeding process. So that's the primary focus of the committee from, again, the very first day of the season all the way up until Selection Sunday. And we have about 3 different calls with the committee during the year. We just had one about a week ago. And we'll have, as you mentioned, the selection orientation meeting here shortly, where each of the conference monitors will report out to their colleagues how they assess the conference and the teams that are in the conference. So it's a very thorough process, and it has proven to be quite successful. The reason the chair doesn't have a conference or conferences to monitor is that he or she is overseeing the entirety of the group and the entirety of the country, and we don't burden them with the responsibility of any single conference.
Dan, is the committee watching a lot of television games on television? Is there any live viewing of those teams in that conference? Do they have the ability to jump on a plane and go watch, say, Kansas play Kansas State, something like that?
An awful lot of watching, no question, of broadcast games. That's really an obligation of all the committee members to do that pretty regularly. The in-person evaluation, attending games, is not an obligation. It's not discouraged. It's encouraged. But we recognize that all of these committee members have very busy jobs on campus or in conference offices, and their ability to get out to games may vary. And so we find that most committee members see an awful lot of games in person just by the regular course of their work, their everyday job work. And they will take the initiative to get to some games in their local area of conferences they're monitoring, or just teams that they think they want to learn more about from a national perspective. But we don't reimburse, for travel to get to games. It's not an obligation. We talk about that with some regularity, but we need to have incredible people serve on these committees. Right. Some of them would have the time to be able to do that, and others would not, depending on their job and their role on campus. So again, we don't make it an obligation, but we definitely find that there's an awful lot of live game evaluation that happens over the course of the season, and then certainly an enormous amount of games are watched on broadcast.
Dan, talk about the February practice that you'll go through with the committee. Do you allow media to come to that? Is it just the committee? Tell us about what you do.
Sure. It's just the committee now, Gene, but it used to be, you may recall, we had a media mock selection exercise that used to coincide with that selection orientation meeting. That ran for a number of years. We paused that a few years ago because we found that most the media that were interested had been through it at least once, if not a couple of times. Uh-huh. And so we weren't getting the same attendance that we had gotten in previous years. So we decided to kind of pause that program. We might restart it, in the future, because media members certainly got an awful lot out of it, understanding how the process works in March. But the committee does go through exactly what they will experience in March. It's really important, especially for new committee members who haven't been through it before, but even ongoing committee members, that they get a refresher on how the process works. So, it's a shorter time period because selection week goes from Wednesday to Sunday in March, and the selection orientation meeting is really just 2.5 days. So it's a little abbreviated, but they will go through the same process of selecting at-large teams, considering teams, for that process, and then seeding the field and bracketing the field as if the tournament was going to start that day, just based on games played up to that date in mid-February.
Dan, okay, let's go on past the practice now. The committee comes to Indianapolis, and I think you have a whole floor of a hotel. I think that's what you've told me in the past. Yes. They come in on Tuesday night. Tell us what goes on Tuesday night, and then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and up till probably 6 o'clock on Sunday.
They come in on Tuesday, as you mentioned, Gene, and get settled into the hotel. It is a very private and confidential space, so the only people that can access the area of the selection room and the meeting room, the eating room and the viewing room are the committee members and the select staff that are there to support their work. We actually have a guard that security that mans the door to make sure that it stays that way. So they get settled on Tuesday night. On Wednesday morning, we start, and by lunchtime or so on Wednesday, they will submit what we call the initial ballot. And the initial ballot is, we ask all the committee members to select up to 36 at-large teams as of that day, based on their season-long evaluation. Teams that they are committed should be in the field regardless of how they play or their conference tournament may play out that weekend. So they're kind of the no-brainers. And they also select teams that they think should be under consideration. So they don't think they're at-large teams yet on Wednesday afternoon, but they think they should be evaluated and considered for at-large selection over the course of the weekend. And in order to get into the field as an at-large at that point on the initial ballot, I think they have to have all but 3 or all but 4 eligible votes. And eligible means that there are some recusals. Committee members cannot vote for a school or a conference that they represent. So, for example, Bubba Cunningham from North Carolina cannot vote for North Carolina at any point in the process. He has to be recused from that.
Would Bubba be allowed to talk about other teams in the Atlantic Coast Conference?
Only factually. In his league, only factually. He cannot be part of discussion and offer opinion about teams in the ACC. But he can be there to clarify a factual statement. When North Carolina, for example, is discussed, if they're being discussed before a vote as to whether they would be selected as an at-large team or where they would be seated, Bubba would have to actually be out of the room. He can't even be in the room for that discussion, let alone vote for North Carolina in that capacity. And the same goes for every committee member. Jamie Powell at Iowa State, the same thing. And if you're a conference commissioner like Bernadette McGlade from the Atlantic 10, she can't be in the room when any Atlantic 10 team is discussed in that regard. So it is, and we follow that very, very carefully. Like that, there's no wiggle room, there's no gray area there. They're committed to the recusal policies.
Okay, so take us further into Wednesday afternoon and Wednesday night. This is when you're watching games because the tournaments are going on. And how many televisions do you have going?
Well, before we even get to that, just finish that initial ballot. So once the initial ballot is submitted by all 12 committee members, now we've created our boards. We created an at-large board. We have probably at that point, on average, low 20s in number of at-large teams that would be considered to be in the field at that time. And then upwards of, anywhere from 30 to 40 teams that would be on the under consideration board. So they didn't get enough votes to get into the field on the initial ballot, but they're under consideration officially and will be discussed and evaluated and voted on throughout the course of the weekend. Chair discretion after the initial ballot is cast and we have those boards created. Oftentimes they'll go ahead and select a few more teams because they want to get to populating some more of the field even on Wednesday. Or the other thing that they'll do and would do certainly by the end of the day on Wednesday is start to seed the field, at least initially. And I say initially because, of course, by Wednesday, there's still an awful lot of games to be played in the conference tournaments. And seeding does not become final until Sunday when the bracket is ready to be put together. But it's important to get ahead of that process a little bit and start putting teams in some order on the seed list in order to create work that doesn't have to be too much over the course of the weekend. And then, we kind of follow depending on when teams are playing, so we can watch teams play in their conference tournaments. It's an interesting process, Gene, in that you get on Thursday and Friday where you have a bunch of teams in the field, you've got some teams that are initially seeded, and you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself, because there are so many games that are still being played. And while there's not additional weight that are put on those games necessarily versus those that are played in the regular season, you don't want to get to a situation where you've gone too far in selecting or seeding the field, and then you have games play out on Friday or Saturday, and you kind of start to second guess, well, maybe we shouldn't have put this team in or shouldn't have seeded them where they are because they just suffered a loss or there's been an injury or something to be taken into consideration. So it's very much an iterative process. Voting, it's just a voting process, really. And we have to pace ourselves with the chair accordingly to make sure that we stay on schedule, but don't get too far ahead of the process.
Okay, good. All right, now as you're coming into Saturday and Sunday, what happens on Saturday? Do you start the funnel that some of the teams just are better than some of the other teams and your numbers get a little bit smaller?
Sure. Well, the other thing that happens throughout the course of the week is you've got conference tournaments finishing, and their AQs, their automatic qualifiers, being determined. So that happens on Tuesday night even, and the weekend before the committee gets together, and certainly on Wednesday as well. Saturday is a huge day because traditionally there's 14 or so conference championship finals that happen on that day. So the automatic qualifiers from those tournaments become determined on Saturday. So that has a big bearing because an automatic qualifier could take the place of an at-large team. If you have an upset in a major conference, for example, of a team that that wins their conference tournament that otherwise wouldn't have gotten in as an at-large team, that knocks somebody out, right?
Right.
So so that all is very dynamic on Saturday. The goal on Saturday usually doesn't happen. It always doesn't happen until very late at night. Is to essentially have the entire field selected. So with contingencies. So by Saturday night, by the time the committee goes to bed, the entire field, all 36 at-large teams and contingencies will have been selected. Okay. And what I mean by contingencies is there's often a situation where the committee will have selected 37 or 38 at-large teams, and the 37th or 38th team won't get in unless certain games play out in a certain manner on Sunday. So we have to have those kind of teams in holding in order to be prepared with the 5 or so conference championship games that happen on Sunday, depending on how those play out. So the entire field will be selected by the time the committee goes to bed on Saturday night.
Okay. Dan, I often wonder, let's just say that on Saturday, in the semifinals of a conference championship, one of the really good teams' point guard goes down, and it happens to be a high ankle sprain, or it happens to be an ACL, or whatever it might be. How does that affect the committee's feeling or the committee's idea on whether that team should get in, or whether that team should be now not a 2-seed or a 3-seed, but rather a 4-seed? How does that work?
Well, player and coach availability is always taken into consideration, not just during the conference tournament, but throughout the season as well, because it can have a bearing on a team's development and progress and their evaluation. That's often misunderstood to say that somehow the committee, dismisses or gives grace to losses, when players are out or coaches are out. That's not the case. But it needs to be taken into consideration for seeding in particular. I think your question really gets at the seeding of the field more than selection. I don't recall a time particularly where the committee has not selected a team as an at-large because they've had an injury and are concerned about how that could diminish the team's ability to compete. But they do try to take into consideration, within reason, player availability from a seeding perspective. It's very challenging during the conference tournament because oftentimes you don't have full information to work with. We try to get information from the school, from the conference, as to whether it's a season-ending injury or it's just an injury that will have to be day-to-day, and the player may be available for the first round of the tournament. If it's a season-ending injury, obviously it's quite different when the player won't be available versus where he or she may be available to play in the championships. More often than not, I would say it probably doesn't have a huge bearing on where a team is seated because, it's just, it's hard to determine exactly how much that's going to impact the team's competitiveness. But, if the committee feels strongly that, look, this team is going to be without their best player for the entirety of the tournament, their leading scorer, their captain, that has a material impact, not just on where that team should be seated, but frankly, where their opponents are seated. Like, right. So, if you misseed a team, that it could impact that side of the bracket as well. So, anyways, long-winded answer to your question. It's always a difficult one for the committees to wrestle with, but it's important to take into consideration all the information you have at your disposal.
Great. Dan, I know you're a real advocate for women's basketball, always have been. How does the women's committee, how do they work? And are they also in Indianapolis? And can you go back and forth and supervise or be a help to both committees?
They are in Indianapolis. The process is nearly identical in terms of the hotel setup and the computers that are used and the services and support that are provided by NCAA staff. They are independent because, of course, the tournaments are independent and the committees are as well. But the processes are very, very similar and the support is the same. I don't have the opportunity to go back and forth. We have a women's basketball vice president, Lynn Holzman, who does an outstanding job supporting the women's basketball committee, and her responsibility is to be there to support them in the way that I help to support the men's committee. So we're really confident that it's a great process. We've got great committee members on the women's committee, and the one thing I think that's changed a little bit in just the last few years in particular is the committees collaborate a little bit more than they used to in the past. And I mean, not necessarily during selection week because they have their work that has to be done for their championship, but in preparation throughout the year and sharing notes and process and making sure that the processes and their work is as aligned and collaborative as possible.
Great. All right, Dan, let's talk about where the first and second rounds will be played, where the championship will be played, where down the road. How does a school? I know it's a school or a league that has to apply, but how do you get a first and second round? How do you get a regional? How does a school in a city get a Final Four? Can you go through that process with us?
Sure. It happens years in advance, Gene. We have Final Fours now awarded out through 2030. 2030 for the men, 2031 for the women. So the Final Fours in particular have to be awarded years in advance because of the need to secure the playing venue, of course, convention center space for NABC and WBCA conventions and other ancillary events that happen around the Final Fours, and then the hotel rooms, of course. So it is a lengthy process that happens years in advance. The same thing goes for the preliminary rounds, the first and second rounds, the regionals. They happen and are awarded years in advance. Schools partner with local CBBs and sports authorities essentially to bid for NCAA championships, basketball and otherwise. And each of the rounds of the tournaments have to be hosted by either a member conference or member institution, or in some cases, more than one. We have 4 host institutions for the men's Final Four this year in Houston, for example. That's how the process works. It's very competitive. We have bid specifications that need to be met in order to be considered, and it's an important process for the cities and the venues and the schools that are interested in hosting, and it's obviously a very important process for NCAA championships as well.
Okay. I want to talk to you also about where you send some of the better teams. I remember working with C.M. Newton at the University of Kentucky, and we had an outstanding team. I don't know if it was 92 or 93. I forget right now. It might have been 91. But we got sent to Vanderbilt to play at Vanderbilt from the first and second round. And everybody thought that was a really great thing, but we only got 250 tickets to the regional, and you know what that's like and how Kentucky travels. We would have rather been far away because when you divide up 250 tickets. You give the players their tickets so their parents can come. You give some to the students. You give some to the board of trustees. I mean, there's just no tickets left. So how do you determine that?
Well, the schools don't have a say as to where they're assigned. Of course, they'd love to have that opportunity. We do, and just in the last few years, actually get one team has the opportunity to say where they would like to be assigned for first and second rounds of regionals, and that's the overall number one seed. That's the only one, and that was a result of some recommendations that came from a number one seed years ago, and I think it makes a lot of sense. But after that, there's principles and procedures that we put in place to assign where teams are sent. Essentially, we try to send the higher seeded teams to first and second round sites as close to their campus as possible, because it helps with ticket sales. It helps with attendees and creating an environment where fans can get to the first and second rounds in an accessible way without having to get on a plane, hopefully, and just drive to the first and second rounds. And then the regionals are assigned out based on where teams are seated. And again, they will be assigned to regionals closer to their campus, should they be on a certain line on the seed list. But if we happen to have, for example, 4 number one seeds that are east of the Mississippi, one of those is going to go west because we have 4 regionals, right?
Right.
In the east, the south, the Midwest, and the West, and so we do balance out all 4 regions based on the strength of the field and make sure that no one region is more competitive and stacked than another.
Okay, great. I have to ask you about the floors. There's a different floor every first and second round, every regional. There's a different floor for the Final Four. Who designs those? Who are they made by? Are schools allowed to purchase those following the tournament? I mean, how does that go?
Well, Connor is our partner for our courts. We do own some of those courts, and some of them are borrowed essentially from Connor and moved around. But it's been a really important part of the tournament because it brings continuity, right? You're in 14 different sites from first 4 through the Final 4, and to have some consistency with the courts and the branding and logos and makes it a national event that is recognizable for those that are watching on TV, which is most of the fans, right? And it brings consistency from a playability standpoint, right? We have the very best courts from a safety perspective for the players, and so the schools do have the opportunity, especially schools that win the national championship, have the opportunity to purchase the court that they won the championship on, and oftentimes, Gene, they do purchase that court and then use it for fundraising purposes. They'll take the center jump circle, the logo that's the Final Four logo in the middle of the court, and they'll repurpose it and put it in their practice facility or their playing venue. So yeah, we have that happen quite frequently. It's kind of a memorial and a Hall of Fame type of thing to put into their venues. Yeah,
you know what? The consistency I'm just thinking about. If you're playing at 8 different courts, they're all, sometimes the out of bounds line might be the color of the school or whatever. All of your courts are identical in that, there's white playing lines and the whole bit. So that really does make it fair. Will the Final Four always be played in an indoor football facility?
I think so. Yeah, several years ago, one of my first years at the NCAA, I've been at the NCAA for 10 now. We did, the committee wanted to kind of think about and talk about whether there's maybe one time for an anniversary or something like that the Final Four could be played at a traditional arena rather than a stadium. So we went through a bit of an exercise about how that would work financially, how the ticket allocations would work. And the bottom line was it just really isn't feasible anymore. With the popularity and the demand for tickets, you mentioned earlier, first and foremost, the 4 teams that get there, but also athletic directors and commissioners and the NABC convention and our corporate partners and champions. There's so much demand for Final Four tickets. All the allocations would come down to such a level that it really wouldn't be workable. I think we could probably make it kind of work financially, but it would be a big financial hit as well. But really, where we, after studying it, determined that it was probably not feasible, unfortunately, anymore, was around the ticket allocations and how they would shrink.
I haven't been to so many Final Fours. I know there's some people who will complain that they're far away from the floor and all, but it really gives people an opportunity to be there and to feel the enthusiasm and the excitement of a Final Four. And okay, you might be a little bit further removed from the court, but there's screens all over that you can watch. And there's all kinds of refreshments that you can have. So I think it makes sense.
It's a unique experience. There's no question about that. And even from a player's perspective, you think, even the greatest players in college basketball that will go on to play in the NBA and maybe win, Olympic gold medals and world championships, they'll never play in an arena where there's 60,000 plus fans, 70,000 fans. So it really is a unique opportunity for players to have a once in a lifetime kind of experience.
Well, that concludes today's On the Fly podcast. I'm your host, Gene DeFilippo, and I want to thank Dan Gavitt for his insight. Thanks for your time this time, and we'll see you next time.